So for all of you who are just joining us now, a very, very warm welcome to the first edition of the CPR Dialogues, Navigating India's 21st Century Transitions. Welcome to the opening panel, also called India's 21st Century Transitions. The panel will be chaired by our President and Chief Executive, Center for Policy Research, Yamini Iyer. And we've got an esteemed set of panelists with us. We've got here Jamshed Godrej, Chairman and MD, Godrej and Boyce. We've got T.N. Ninan, Chairman, Business Standard Limited. We've got Mr. Rajiv Kumar, Vice Chairman, Niti Aayog. And we've got Dr. Pratap Bhanu Mehta, Vice Chancellor, Ashoka University. Over to you, Yamini.
Thank you, Rajika. Thank you all for being here tonight. It's an absolute pleasure to see so many friends and supporters of CPR out here in such large numbers. Really appreciate it. And what's particularly special about today is that we have on our panel new and old friends of CPR. Especially exciting for us to welcome back Rajiv and Pratap back into CPR's fold. So thank you all, and thank you, Jamshed and Nainan, for being here. I thought I'll just take a couple of minutes to give you all a little bit of a sense of what we're trying to do over the course of these 2 days, and how we hope the opening panel will frame the conversation. As people who've been involved in policy making, both from the inside and the outside, one of the big frustrations we often have is policy making in India often confuses or rather conflates the short term with the long term, and the short term becomes the end in itself. In CPR, we've scratched our heads about this consistently and always felt that it was important to step out of the short term and actually take a long view, because the decisions we are making today have significant impact on the future. And we think this question is particularly relevant in India today because it's quite clear, even from a quick glance at the newspapers every morning, that India is going through a very significant transition. The headlines scream about agrarian distress, the crisis of jobs, air pollution in Delhi. There seems to be a significant moment. But underlying this moment is a much larger set of developmental challenges and concerns. Which in fact suggests that the crisis that we are facing today, or the challenges that we are facing today, are symptoms of a larger set of concerns that we need to begin engaging with. The agrarian crisis is in part a consequence of low agricultural productivity, but it's also about the slow and unpredictable transition from agrarian to non-farm economies. It's also about the nature of our urbanization transition. It's also confronting us at a time when we have in India a 20th century problem of 50% of students out of class 5 barely being able to read standard 2 text, and then technology and the labor market going through this massive transformation that makes that old continuum of manufacturing, of urban context being spaces where manufacturing comes together and the old style of factory jobs coming together, suddenly thrown up in the air. And as India's economy grows, we also have the big challenge of meeting energy demands, but meeting them in ways that are green and sustainable. We also have the big question of thinking about how do we avoid the chaos of Delhi, Mumbai, and Calcutta in our urban transition, and think about building new urban trajectories that are truly inclusive and sustainable. And all of these, in fact, intersect with each other. But they also come at a time when our politics is going through quite a significant churn. We spent some time this morning talking about the changing Indian voter and the combination of aspirations and anxieties that are placing new challenges on our polity. The question for us is our polity in fact ready now to think of a new development deal? Election after election, it seems quite clear that the Indian public is quite frustrated with the current development model. It's not going the way it should. The question is, what should the new development deal be? And is our politics and our institutions agile and ready to face these transitions? Over the course of the next 2 days, we're going to delve into these. We had some conversations this morning and more to come tomorrow. We're going to delve into these in more depth. And we're going to close tomorrow with the big picture chaos in the globe, all of which has significant impacts on the kinds of policy decisions we take in the near future in India. But what we hope to do right now in the opening panel is sort of step back and take a 30,000 feet view and try to explore some of these issues, explore the intersections across these issues, and really what I think is particularly important for us, ask ourselves whether India is ready to make the kinds of policy choices it needs to determine the appropriate pathways and institutional mechanisms for a sustainable and inclusive development future. And it's a real privilege for me and for CPR to have here with us such a wonderful, esteemed panel to debate some of these issues. But just before I get into it, just a quick word of thanks to all my colleagues at CPR that have indulged the idea of bringing different parts of CPR together into a conversation. This is a little new for us, but all of us, all my colleagues have been very indulgent of me and have participated and shown good public spirit in the idea. So I want to take the opportunity to thank all of them and for what's going to be, I think, a very exciting conversation this evening and tomorrow. And also especially to call out our communications team, whose talent and imagination goes far beyond what any of us dull policy researchers are capable of. They've made us look slick and creative, which is all thanks to them. So today is, in many ways, thanks to their abilities, and a special thank you to them. So now to the substance.
Yeah.
Thank you. So Rajiv, can I start with you? And can I ask you to first reflect a little bit, indulge in some crystal ball gazing about India's economy. Where do you see the next 10 years? It's been a bumpy ride. And there are, of course, important questions to ask about where our growth is going to be located and how. And also, if you could talk to us a little bit about how the challenges of energy, urbanization, sustainability then intersect with the challenges of growth. And let's not forget technology, too, that we spoke about a couple of hours ago. So can I begin with you?
Well, thanks, Rangamani, for inviting me to this esteemed panel. I sort of feel, maybe I'm not in the right place because 30,000 feet is something very high above what I do at the moment. So I've given up some of that completely. But and also wonderful to be back amongst friends and CPR and yeah. So the questions that you raised, that you asked just now, it'll be, I think, for a country like ours, it's almost like foolhardy to predict anything like that, for the next 10 years and so on, because, I think it's the nature of our polity, economy, whatever, that we make do with what we get and we respond. But nonetheless, let me try I think the two or three biggest challenges or the things that I sort of feel is that one, it's clearly long time actually for the modernization of our agriculture. And modernization of our agriculture doesn't mean raising output, raising productivity, counting rate of growth, etc. But, sort of ensuring that you get agriculture which is, value adding, which is got high technology, which can use all of that, which is agro-processing, which is, more competitive. Is the whole issue of raising costs and then raising, support prices and then sort of, carrying on like that is not taking us anywhere at all. We need to think through as to how we can, reduce cost in agriculture. And I dare say that I find some of the new experiments being done with people like Subhash Palekar, etc., who are, who are going away from a chemical-based agriculture into a more, bio and natural farming base is probably one way. But we need to think through in very almost like, let me use the word dramatic manner, what we want to do with agriculture. That requires deep thinking. I don't think we can't carry on with business as usual there. That's my first And this sort of just one liner which I sort of these days give always is that, the farmers grow tomatoes and throw them away, and because they don't get the price, and yet we import 3,000 crore worth of tomato puree for pizza toppings, in our country. Now this is something, just a matter of value addition, and we can become globally competitive there. The second one, of course, is that we must increase the share of public goods and services in our consumption basket, in our workers, especially in our workers' consumption basket. I think we are one of the very few countries which has so far relied upon private expenditure to take care of your education, health, transport, etc., etc. I mean, except bar a few firms, bar a few companies, the fact that 85% or 80% of our workforce and still in the unorganized sector shows that the workers are just left on their own means, as it were. So maybe this beginning of that is in things like Ayushman Bharat but overall it means very much improving the delivery of public services and accepting the government's responsibility for that and not shying away. And this is where I think a lot of us have to face the sort of look at ourselves, because I think we, the elite of the country, has decided a long time ago to find private solutions to public problems, and that's the way we've gone. And you can see that water pumps, electricity generators, law and order, chaps outside your gate, all of these are so we need to ensure and I think an accountable, efficient, and transparent governance which would go by the name of the development state. You can't get away from it, and not just at the center. The center is not the cutting edge. It's actually in the states that matter, and therefore we need to focus. And that's a very big one, because I don't think enough attention. So that's the second one. The third, of course, is, and I think again this is probably, and I've just come from a session with the CII, and the question there was raised that we know we've been talking about these things for years. People know the answers. We know what to do. Why don't we do it together? And why don't it get done? And I think that is because my own understanding is that we lack perhaps a common understanding of in a focused manner of what needs to be done in the next whatever number of years. And I say that because if you do that, then that's where that can constitute, if you like, a definition or an understanding of a national interest, which can become the basis of some trust between different stakeholders. At the moment, we are defined by, if you like, a huge amount of mistrust, between different stakeholders, industry versus government, large industry versus small industry, MNCs versus domestic industries. So there is this huge, so therefore there is no sort of, hasn't been so far coherent, implicit strategy even in what we are doing. So that, and I think this matter of trust is a very big one, because, and how do we create that? So that's the third point that I would want to mention. And finally, I think, let me say that we need to face head-on the new technology and because I'm sure that the new technology actually can be made most inclusive rather than exclusion, as people are afraid. It's not robots versus our workers, not at all. I think the new technology, whether it's the Internet of Things or it's the or it's machine learning or it's sensors. I mean, I think the best example of that could well be of, let's say, using sensors which are becoming cheaper by the day to improve your use of water in your irrigation. And water is a huge crisis facing us, but the solution would not be just to take water, but to be able to say that, look, how do we use technology? So the and the final, therefore, related to that is a huge pity, therefore, that our industry spends 0.3% of its revenues on R&D. And our higher education system gets 0.04%, and the averages in the world our 0.3 is 1.5% globally, and our higher education 0.04 is about 0.4. So 10 times and 6 times. Now, we need to somehow come to an understanding that we will not be a society that is able to accept the challenge of the 21st century if we continue to, keep talking about the knowledge economy, keep priding ourselves, in whatever, but are satisfied with jugaad. So we need to go beyond that, and we need to create this whole innovation ecosystem, a school level upwards. And this is where I think something like the Atal Innovation Mission is doing, whatever. But that's a very big thing, So why isn't there in this country a much bigger, push for understanding the technology, coming out with new innovations and using it to solve our employment problem or our environmental problem, employment problem, or our urbanization problem. For example, I think we just did this conference on mobility. It's very clear to us, to everybody, I think, that India cannot afford to be following the same model as the US, which is personalized transport model. We have to go to the public transport, and shared, connected, and electric mobility offers that huge way forward. But, let's see. I mean, this is the challenge that I am facing at the moment. We should be able to get our act together, and that's the sort of effort that we need to make in several fields going forward.
Thank you. I think you've very neatly laid out what we need to do. Nailan, if I can bring you in, how do we get there? And are there lessons that we can learn from economies around the world that have negotiated similar transitions? And what are the kinds of policy reforms that we need to be debating in the here and now?
I'm not sure which countries would be comparators for a system like ours, because we have to function on a scale that most economies do not have to deal with. We also have to function on scale while being relatively a low-income society. So costs are more important than they might be elsewhere. And third, the productivity challenges that we face today are relatively easy to handle. So I don't see barriers to growth for some time yet, in terms of having to deal with a whole new set of issues. The key transition, and when you're looking at 21st century transition, we have to look at both continuities and discontinuities. And if not radical discontinuities, then transition points. And the continuity, I think, will come from the growth rate, which broadly will stay where it has been, at around 7%. So if you were to look at a 2030 perspective, and beyond that, frankly, it's hard to get visibility. You're likely talking about a $6 trillion economy. And Japan is today the world's third largest at just under 5 trillion. So you're talking of real scale, which only 2 countries have seen so far. You are then talking of a per capita income, which would have moved up from about $2,000 today to $4,000. That's roughly where Indonesia is just now. So if you want to look at what kind of system this may be, Indonesia provides some answers. And you will therefore still be, in many ways, an emerging market system. You would not be a developed economy. Just to compare with the other BRICS countries, Brazil is today at about 8,500. China is at about 8,500. Brazil is at 8 or 9,000. Russia is about 10 or 11. So we will, even in 2030, be at less than half where they are now in terms of individual living standards. So that gives you a rough framework of, and the way I see it is that we will be Indonesia multiplied 3 or 4 times. And the significance of the multiplication is that you will get roughly a doubling of per capita income. Since 1991, we've seen a roughly trebling of per capita income. So you will do as much more again by 2030. And you've seen in the trebling of per capita income, you've seen many markets grow tenfold. Some, of course, even much more, like telecom. And you can continue to see the prospect that in 10 or 12 years, many of today's markets will have again grown 5, 8 times. So there is going to be a huge change taking place on massive scale. Now, coping with that is itself an issue. And I think the biggest national challenge we have to face is that we are pretty much coming to the end of the road with what the 1991 and post-period reforms have brought us to. We now need a new phase. And the way I look at it is that we've done so far things that work for the top 30% of the people. We've not done it for the remaining, by and large, we've not done it for the remaining 70%. So we did cars, but we didn't do public transport. We did white-collar employment creation. We didn't do blue-collar employment creation. We did civil aviation reform. We didn't do railway reform. So, there is a clear divide. And the challenge, therefore, is in the next 10 or 12 years to take it, I don't think you can take it up to 100%, but at least take it up to 60%. So deepening the market while it's growing this way gives you, in many ways, exponential growth. So the question is, how do you get to the bottom 60%? There is already many programs, there are already many programs underway which are doing the last mile attempt. The last mile for electricity connectivity, for cooking gas, for sanitation, and so on. So you've already begun to look at saying you've got to go beyond this 30%. And you have, again, Rajiv sort of referred to it, you have a whole set of technology platforms being created, what is called the India Stack, which will create, will set up platforms for a whole new range of businesses to go much deeper, like credit. Viral Acharya at the RBI spoke a day or two ago about this whole public credit registry, which will create a certain transparency in the credit market in terms of cash flows for medium and small businesses, which will make it much easier for them to get credit than credit based on collateral. So, so that's one. The whole payment system. We have, in the same way that Uber and Ola are riding on a GPS system. So you create platforms that allow businessmen to then launch whole new businesses that automatically have massive scale. And you can do it in education, you can do it in health. So harnessing technology to deepen reform and get it to there is, I think, a massive opportunity. I can go on with other things, but I think other time is waiting, so, I should stop.
No, I think that was very helpful. And Jamshed, if I can come to you on just to take the point forward, how does industry see this deepening of markets? What is its preparedness? And particularly in terms of how it's responding to the challenge of expanding the market, but at the same time keeping in mind the energy transitions, the need to be sustainable, the renewable market changing. So what does this mean in the long term for how industry views India's growth and whether industry can be a partner in the sustainable growth that we are seeking?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's certainly a big question that you're asking. My view is that, especially in manufacturing, we have sort of created a golden handcuff around industry over the last 50 years. And we are starting to break that down one by one slowly. I think GST was certainly a very bold step to start breaking that down. I think that, we need to think about everything that has been a constraint in manufacturing to be actually broken down in such a way that we can make that transition
to an efficient economy. Where we are missing out really is that, the manufacturing industry has, over the years, got over-regulated. And I think that if we can find a way to completely deregulate manufacturing, we will be able to make strides. I think there is no doubt, as Mr. Nainan just said, that we have done it sort of catered to the top 20%. And if we have to start catering to the balance, then we need to be far more efficient. We need to be able to reduce the cost of goods and services significantly. In a hot country like India, we do know that refrigeration and air conditioning provide huge productivity boosts, but our penetration levels, are extremely low. If you think about food and agriculture and reform there, the very fact that we only get apples from Australia and Bombay and not from India clearly shows, that things have broken down completely. So what I would say is that let's think about how we can deregulate manufacturing far beyond what we've done in GST. The labor markets, skilling, there is huge opportunity on export. I've always maintained that because our share in export is so low, global export percentage, doubling our export should really not be any difficulty at all. But what are the reasons why we're not able to? Rajiv raised a good point about innovation and R&D and whether we should be spending a lot more or not. I don't think there's any debate that we should be spending more. I think the problem for industry is that what do you spend on? Because you will spend on something that has a market, and you will not spend on something that will not have a market. And especially in consumer products, where we do see huge growth currently and in the future, I think spending on R&D is happening. So, like everything else, when you look at a number, you have to disaggregate it and see where it is actually being spent, etc. One area which I have personally been very, happy about, and we have done such a wonderful job, is in space, for instance. If you see the progress that we have made in space, putting these probes right in, on to Mars and everywhere else, putting the number of satellites in space, that program is really exceptional in the world. We have encouraged our engineers, etc., to be innovative, to take risks, to do something that has put India, on the global map. And we do it at a cost. Of course, I can't comment on, which costs are included and which are not included in the cost that we say is included. But the costs that we talk about are extremely low for those type of space probes. That's the sort of thing we must do in defense. We must replicate what we've done in space in defense. We must replicate that in so many other strategic areas in industry. And we're not doing it. But, we have a wonderful example in space, and we should really see whether we can build on that. And the other area that, it is very clear to me that since many, many years now, industry has been paying a huge cost for energy. And I think this energy reform, whether you call it an energy transition or an energy reform, which really looks not just at renewable energy as a major component, but we have to look at every aspect of energy. And to begin with the grids, the way that the state electricity boards are managed today, how they are organized, the difference between a state board and a central sort of organization like NTPC, the way our grids are managed. We are killing our solar industry today because we have allowed the state electricity boards to place tariffs, on the transmission of solar energy from one place to another place, and there's no limit to it. And they can do it every year. So if I want to buy solar energy, I don't know what my price is going to be next year, because tomorrow the state electricity boards can just increase it. So I think these are the structural issues which are preventing this type of transition from happening. And, there's no doubt in my mind that if we put our mind to these big challenges and transitions that are there, we must first deconstruct them, look at what is holding each part of it up, and really look at changing and I do hope that, we move rapidly to understand these issues. I think Rajiv made a good point on mobility, which is it's not only about electric mobility, it's about the ability to move people and goods. We shouldn't forget the goods transport whilst we look at the mobility of people. By raising the quality of our public transport so that everybody would like to take public transport. I mean, until that happens, you're going to have a situation where people will use their personal transport. So I think that some of these structural things have to be changed. I was really shocked to hear that in Bombay, the BEST, which runs the bus service, their passengers have come to half of what they were 5 years ago. And it's an amazing statistic that here, you should have a situation where, and it's all because not just of, the shared mobility things like Uber and Lyft and all those other ones, but the fact that the number of private cars on the road have increased to such an extent that now the buses have come down. The load on the trains has actually gone up. But the load on the buses has come down, and BEST as an organization is almost not viable anymore, because of the ridership having come down so much. So I think these are the sort of things that we'll have to look at very carefully if we have to make these big transitions.
So I think there are two important things that I'm hearing from the remarks so far. To pick up on what Nayan said and what Jamshed you said, we the first phase of our growth story of the last 25 years seems to have focused on the 30%, and it's time now for us to shift. Does that mean, Pratap, that we are at the cusp of a new politics? Is there really a shift in the elite consensus? And what does this mean also for the second issue that I think has come up, our institutions' capability to be responsive? There are clear structural constraints in which we are negotiating these transitions. How do we think about reforming our institutional capability to move forward and onward?
It's wonderful to be here. Big question, Jamini. A couple of thoughts. I think first, just to be a little provocative, I think our politics is changing. I think it's changing, and I don't mean there's a particular moment at which it changed. That underlying current has been there for a long while, which is our voters are agile, our voters are nimble. I think even political parties were very slow in recognizing that the standard templates of social coalitions do not quite work in Indian politics the way they used to. I mean, if you just look at the distribution of social groups across both parties in these elections, it's very astonishing. I mean, I think the idea of saying that there was class blocks has no explanatory value, right? The ability to throw out governments. In that sense, you might say, our politics is changing, which is that there is actually room for creating a new kind of discourse, right? That's the good news. I think the bad news is, despite, I think, what we will hear in this room, which we will hear in this room, kind of interesting that I think Nayan, Rajiv, both kind of alluded to the fact that we need to think beyond the 1991 paradigm, right? From the 30% down to the rest of the 60%, from private to public, in some ways that's been the second major theme, and possibly a different take on globalization, not deglobalization, but a different way of handling it. So I think you're going to see an elite consensus in this room that this shift needs to take place. Here's the nasty question. Can you actually get up public investment without raising taxes? That's the fundamental contradiction of modern social democracy, right? We all want to say public things. We all want to say increase participation, increase investment. And I think we will continue to delude ourselves that you can actually do this without higher rates of taxation. Europe is facing, I mean, you just see the protests in France, right? The demands. Every single demand is in place, which is correct one, pension, social security. Oh, by the way, we also want a tax cut, right? That was the fundamental contradiction within social democracy, right? Or at least that stands in the way of creating a genuine social democracy. So that's one way in which I think there will be an elite consensus, but it will be, the delivery mode will be still very incremental business as usual. Every government will do about one or two schemes right, one or two schemes moderately well, and the rest will languish for want of resources or want of state capacity, right? So I think, as I said, follow the money, right? Second issue in follow the money is, which is the crisis of liberal democracy and the crisis of delivery is in part the crisis of plutocracy, right? And plutocracy comes in very many shapes and forms, not just outright corruption. That's the easy to spot manifestation. It is the way social power is structured in society that actually prevents genuine participation from bubbling from below. So we are still, in many ways, governments of contractors, by contractors, for contractors. That's a form of plutocracy, right? If we want to create a new social contract, well, I'm sympathy with, I think, Mr. Godre had said, which is you need to liberate productivity and production from shackles, right? And the other side of the social contract is it's private production for public use, right? The credibility of that social contract, as I said, not only depends on the elites actually coughing up the money, right? It also depends on the elites not using their entrenched, concentrated power in different ways, right? To stymie and subvert democratic mobilization from below, in all kinds of ways. It could be control of media. That's a form of plutocracy in its own right? So while the Indian voter is going to, in a sense, wake up and look for new alternatives, I think the credibility of the system to be able to deliver, I think the two oldest problems in democracy, which is, if you want genuine social democracy, somebody has to pay up. And if you want some genuine social democracy, you have to deal with the problem of plutocracy square on. I am pessimistic about our ability to do both of those things at this moment. I'll just give one last comment, and that's the kind of larger 21st century transition issue you talked about, which is, so India is in this interesting position, if you ask the question, has India made progress? And we are tempted to say both that yes, we have made progress in some areas, we have not made progress in others, but as Immanuel Kant once famously remarked, we are also dying of our progress, right? Which is to say, a next generation of problems, you can think of the environment as one, which has got to be central to any new social contract that we craft, right? That is not the sort of problem that lends itself to easy resolution by the standard frameworks the Indian state deploys, which is you're not going to solve the problem of the environment by schemes, right? The Indian state can do schemes well sometimes. You give it a specified target, you say build X many things, it'll do it, right? You say build X many solar panels, it'll do it, right? The environmental problem, or concomitantly urbanization, which in turn is related to the form of agriculture because there's huge demand links and mobility links between the two. Neither of those two problems can be resolved by the standard administrative paradigms and practices of the Indian state, right? I mean, these are wicked problems in different ways. They require not just an elite consensus, but it's much harder to think about incentive-compatible interventions in these areas, right? I'm actually not convinced that on these things there's actually even enough public demand yet. I mean, I think just talk of elite consensus. I think the discussion around air quality in North India, and it is a North Indian phenomenon, it's not just a Delhi phenomenon, right? If you ever had any optimistic hopes that elite consensus has decisively shifted, just the nature and quality of that discussion will lay it to rest. And I think in confronting that, there is one particular challenge, which, and since we are in a think tank, I think it's worth highlighting, which is the other crisis we have at this moment, globally, this is not just true of India, is the other internal tension in politics and democracy is always the challenge, is the tension between, you might say, expertise and democracy, right? I think it's fair to say you should never underestimate the wisdom of voters, right? On the other hand, translating their preferences into sustainable policies always requires a embeddedness of knowledge in different state structures, in different social systems, right? I think right now we are in this interesting phase, I think, globally, where there is a deep-rooted and I think quite correct suspicion of anybody who claims that kind of expertise. There's a deep-rooted suspicion in part because they've been identified too closely with older plutocratic arrangements, lawyers and economists to begin with, as just to kind of single out the sociology of this. By the way, political scientists don't even count. We are not even worth talking about. So that's. But in the larger sense, right, particularly when you look at things like environmental regulation, food safety regulation, all of that, the sense that our systems of knowledge are actually now embedded in those structures of plutocracy is actually grown in democracies very, very profound. Right? They have no reason to trust us, and they're right not to. Right? So if you're to then come up with intelligent solutions to these problems, then you have to actually think about what are the ways in which knowledge systems interface with larger democratic mobilizations, which you actually can't do without some serious social democracy. And as they say, the problem with social democracy, it costs both time and money.
Thank you, Pratap. That was somewhat pessimistic, though. Rajiv, if I can come back to you, I think one of the important points that Pratap made was about our state institutions and their capability to build a responsiveness to the kinds of challenges that we are facing. As if you were to put on your current hat in the thick of that, how would you respond to that? And what do you see are the things we need to do to strengthen the institutional capability to be able to negotiate and manage these transitions?
Yeah, one, I think, and I checked with Nainan that our tax to GDP ratio, state plus central, is about 16%. So my own understanding is that while we don't want to go to the Scandinavian levels or the North European levels, I think going to 20, 21, 2 is doable, just by, in some sense, widening the tax base and bringing all those people who are at the moment outside the GST and the direct tax net. I mean, you know, if they just if they come into it, we can do this now. But that won't solve the problem. If you remember, I emphasized that the share of public goods and services in the consumption basket has to go up, which means increase in public expenditure. Not maybe, yeah, surely investment too, but you know, expenditure in general. But I think there, 15 months into the government now, huge scope for efficiency, huge scope for improvement there in many, many ways. And we can go into the details, but I mean, we need like never before what was earlier called what a zero budgeting exercise. You know, look at what is needed, what's not needed, and huge process improvement. All along everywhere. I mean, the sort of kind of let me not but you see and if you look at this at the level of the state capitals, even much more so. Very unfortunately, the higher allocation of the finance commissions to state governments of 31 to 42%, whatever, has resulted in a reduction in social sector expenditures in many of the states. But I think the way forward, and I've been wanting to, is to actually, and I said that before, is to improve accountability, which must come at the grassroots level upwards. And I think that's where we need to really focus much more on. We're talking to the Finance Commission as to how we can, sort of reinforce that, because unless that happens and unless you can get, because the public delivery actually happens at that level, and so I think that's where, and now again, I think this is where the new technology makes it so much more feasible. For the first time, we are giving, these tablets to the Anganwadi workers. And we've got the portal in the Ministry of Women and Child Welfare, where they will be maybe at the end of 1 year from now, 12 months, already about, I think, 1/3 of them have already been equipped with that, directly feed in data, and therefore being able to look at, what is happening. So, and I can multiply these examples in many ways. So, what really I'm saying is that, one, I am optimistic about this because I think there is now a clear understanding. And we've tried to give it a bit of a sort of some impulse by doing these rankings that we've done from Niti Aayog, which is trying to set up competitive federalism. And my take on that was that this is perhaps what we can do to derive the democratic dividend that we have. If you get the states to compete with each other, not in competitive populism, but in competitive good governance, then you can get these accountability. And I think what Pratap therefore said is that this will be reinforced hugely by the nimbleness and the and the ability of the electorate to show and very clear messages that this is not what we're doing is not good enough and this is what we want more. So I think the institutional we are too Delhi centered most of the time, and I think the real challenge, a lot of the task is all, I think, shifted away from Delhi. Delhi, 91 was Delhi, you could do whatever you've done, etc. For example, ease of doing business. Yes, we have gone up the ranks, etc., etc., but you talk to any investor, entrepreneur in the States, they'll tell you that, it's probably still the same. So, we need to, so I think that is the one big thing that you've got to do. And second, I think local government institutions, and we have seen this in Niti Aayog with our experiment with the aspirational districts. If once you get the district magistrate, and the collector, along with this sizable machinery that he or she has there, to focus and get a convergent attention. Now, that's the other big one, by the way, which is that this whole thing about silos, down the large. Now, how do you cut across those silos? How do you get a convergent view? Then I think, and to that extent, I think the electorate, the people will drive that change, are driving that change, will drive that change. And to that extent, I'm reasonably optimistic about that. Now, the only thing that I just want to add and repeat here, Jamshed mentioned about manufacturing, is that there are some big things that need to happen. For example, my own understanding, and then I say, the DNA of an Indian company would change if it exports 25%, right? And stops and starts focusing on this mythical thing called the large domestic market, etc., etc. The scales will change. So, and the 4 countries that have had huge manufacturing growth, Japan 50s, Korea 70s, Taiwan 70s, China, have done it through exports. Now, so let's engage. He talked about doubling, the share, etc. Why? And be much bigger. So there are other examples of this, but if we begin with let's say, we come to an understanding that we need accountability, we need local governments to, become much more active. If we need exports to drive, and if we go, and by the way, the big one, which we run, and health is of course, but education. You mentioned that. At the primary school, secondary school education, we the elite have again found our own solutions to that. But the people out there, that's a very big one. So if we get those 5 or 6, common understandings, the rest I think can be achieved.
But I think one of the really critical challenges even on that is the complex political economy in which we are locked, right? So if we think about the question of tax to GDP ratio, one of the big challenges is all of us who are taxpayers are essentially, experiencing the state through the private sector and experiencing the state largely from its regulatory function, which we complain about. And I think, you know, and it's a vicious cycle, because until we don't have a robust public sector that actually delivers, the willingness for for increased taxes is always going to be limited, because you don't see your taxes necessarily delivering, and that sort of locks you in. But there is also another political economy concern, and I was keen to hear your thoughts on that. I mean, we talk about accountability. We talk about the changing nature of our politics from the perspective of the voter, yet our politics is pretty much locked into a complex a relationship around money and cronyism. And in some ways, that comes down to the core of what fundamentally causes that breakdown in accountability. What are your thoughts on that, and are there ways in which we can exit from that?
Well, in a way, our politics is a giant confidence trick. You take money to finance politics and elections from the rich, and you make the promises to the poor, and you actually do stuff for the middle class. This is what we've been doing all along. Now, beyond a point, this is not sustainable, which is why I think we've come to the end of a phase where, because of what you can see happening on the farms, because of this whole issue of jobs, you've come to a critical point of transition. And I want to put the thought to you and to the House that the most important challenge, I mean, there are lots of most important things, water and all that, but a critical issue for us is to have enterprises of scale. To have a much larger formal economy, which, I mean, I used to, in the days when I used to go to Davos a couple of decades ago, you know, all the all the people, businessmen who attend Davos, they all get a page in a book of people who are attending, delegates, and they have to describe their businesses. And all the Indian businessmen would describe everything that they're doing, and always just the number of employees they have, and they would never give you their turnover, because their turnover is actually so small in the presence of these other companies from around the world, which are all counting in billions. And I think, if I remember right, the only Indian businessman who put his finger there in billions was Rahul Bajaj. So today you do have many million plus, billion plus businesses, but the bulk of your garments industry is tiny. In China, they're all large. Rajiv mentioned the tax to GDP ratio at 16-17%. But if we were in Nimrana for the last 3 days, and there were some people here who were present in Nimrana, and some of these numbers came out there, that if you take only the tax-paying segment of the economy, the tax to GDP ratio for that segment is 30%. So you're actually collecting quite a lot of taxes from the people who do pay the taxes. And there's a large segment which is outside the tax framework. And why is that? Because, again, the formal-informal issue. The quality of jobs that comes, this whole business that you don't have proper quality jobs, comes from the formal sector. The tax. So you need a large, in today's thing where you need corporate R&D, you need the budgets for R&D, you need innovation, you cannot do this through small enterprises without scale. You have to create enterprises of scale. You have to create the incentives for people who achieve scale. So, to me, when you look at the big picture of where we need to be by 2030, if you don't create enterprise of scale, you're not going to get there.
Jamshed, what is your take? What do we need to do to achieve precisely that goal? How do we create enterprises at scale, and what is the policy narrative that we need to be thinking about?
Export.
So clearly, you know, we have some structural problems which have been addressed recently, like the reservation for small scale, which no longer exists. But I think, you know, when we look at China especially, you know, they have become so large in so many industries, you know, and it is basically because they never had this artificial barrier as far as small scale industry reservation was concerned. So whether it is clothing or toys or electronics or whatever it is, they've grown to huge scale. The industry that I know very well, which is the air conditioning and refrigeration industry, China has more capacity than the global requirement. That is today. And they are still building factories. So, they are always way ahead as far as capacity is concerned, which is why they are able to give the types of prices that they give when they export. I mean, the really interesting thing is if you look at Japan and China, and Rajiv, I think the point about export really is that these factories are not only large, but they're on the port. Some of these factories have their own ports, private ports. Their shipping costs, their time to ship, I mean, these are all the factors that apply to export. You know that very well. I mean, we need to get, way close to that type of situation before we can think of scale. And I think that, even though those barriers of the past have gone, we still are talking about why is it that small and medium industries are suffering. Whether it's to do with credit, whether it's to do with technology, whether it's to do with the way that they actually, work in a collaborative way. My experience is that when large companies, large in relative, of course, I agree with you, that in the Indian context, large, when they work with a very, very close relationship with the supplier, relationship with large industry, they do extremely well. You can work with them on their supply chain, on the greening of their supply chain. You can work with them on quality. You can work with them on many, many things. And we have shown, in many sectors that this is actually possible when you work in a cluster way. And so competitiveness, really will come only from that. And we will only be able to export if we are competitive. Nobody is going to give us the type of subsidy that China is supposed to give to its manufacturers, in order to be able to be large producers. And so my simple point is that, we spend a lot of time in many, many things. I'm in the process of doubling our production capacity in India. And we are setting up factories all over India. The time that it takes for me to just buy land, actually set up a factory, if I compare that to practically anywhere in Asia, I would be 2, 3, 4 times longer than anywhere else. And these are the things that at the end of the day add up to cost. There's no way you can get away from that. So I think that we really should, especially from the industrial sector, because everyone's been saying that industry will have to employ all these people who will come out of agriculture. I don't see how that's ever going to be possible, because industry itself is reducing jobs because of being more productive. Their quality is improving. They have automation, etc. So until we, have a massive expansion, I don't see how all these people out of, and actually there's no reason why agriculture cannot also be a lot more productive. I was actually quite happy to hear from Mr. Gulati, who's the agricultural expert, that our production of horticulture is now larger than agriculture.
Larger than grain.
Larger than grain.
Larger than grain tonnage.
Grain tonnage, only grain tonnage.
Yes.
Not total agriculture.
No, it's part of agriculture. Horticulture is part of agriculture. So.
But horticulture has grown enormously, okay, which is again an industrial sort of way of doing agriculture in a way, because you have to have, all the right inputs, etc. for it and create the right markets, whether it's to do with fruit or flowers or vegetables or whatever it is. And that's really the future of agriculture, which could then, we see from Israel how productive their farms are, and, that this is what we really have to do to be able to make that transition. So I think this artificial difference between industry, agriculture, services, I don't think we can really have these artificial barriers anymore. We've got to look at it much more holistically and see why we cannot have industrial methods in agriculture, why we cannot have services which are very, very closely linked to manufacturing and to agriculture, etc. I think we've got to look at it that way. And I was really happy that Bhanu talked about air pollution and the environment. And I think I like the point that you made that, we cannot as a country have a social compact or make any real difference, if we can't take basic, air pollution. I think it's all very well to say that you can live in a cocoon with air purifiers in your house and in your car and in your office. And
You make air purifiers.
no, I don't.
We had more faith in India.
It's an artificial thing. I mean, air pollution is such a basic human right, practically to speak, And I think, there are obviously huge number of issues around it. But the basic point is, I don't see the political class in India interested in solving this problem. I think all of us who are concerned with environmental issues, we talk about it all the time. But I really don't see that political interest. And my question really to you also is, how do we get that political interest to do something about this matter? Now, we know that in Beijing, they cleaned up the atmosphere in 2 years. Okay, can we do it in 4 years? Can we do it in 5 years? I don't know. I mean, I'm asking, is it possible? And we all know what the sources are. We all know what some of the solutions are. But is there that political will to actually get it done?
Thank you. Pratap, if I could just, there are two things. One is, of course, in response to what Jamshed just said, is there any scope of our politics and the nature of our elections to actually create a context in which some of these big concerns can be addressed? But there is another elephant in the room. A lot of this conversation about the future of India's economy, the need for expanding our exports, it's all happening in the context of a very disruptive global economy. What are the implications of that? Is this a conversation that we're just having amongst ourselves, which may not go any further given the big picture question in the globe, and how do we begin to even address that?
No, I mean, look, the conversation on globalization is actually a mass conversation, contrary to what we think. I mean, every farmer in India knows how globalization has or has not affected them, right? Export-import policy has affected or not affected them, right? So I'm not quite sure that we kind of, or every small manufacturer knows, right, what happens to products from China and so on and so forth. So I'm not sure the issue is that globalization is a kind of elite issue. And in fact, I think if anything, I think at the elite level, it's a bit too abstract. Right? I mean, we've locked the globalization and integration into the global economy into a series of sort of abstract ideological debates for globalization, against globalization. Whereas this particular conjuncture, particularly if you see what's happening in China, US, Europe, is something where you will have to come to very nimble judgments about globalization, where data protection or not, technology, which technologies or not. I mean, everybody's going back to industrial policy, right? So I think in that sense, I think actually Indian elite discourse is actually not just behind the Indian public discourse, is also, I think, behind global public discourse in some ways. I think about where the tide is turning. So if you just, say exports, well, exports of what, in what context? I think the second thing about the political question, right? I mean, can you get focus is, so I think here's the big challenge for the next foreseeable future. Let's say so. Hazard a guess. It's quite possible that the government at the center will change. In fact, quite likely it will change. But I think the larger question is the following, which is, I think given both the distribution of votes across political parties, it's not likely to be the case that you will get decisive mandates, very decisive mandates. Now, there's good reason to be suspicious of decisive mandates. I think Rajiv Gandhi first term, this government, I think both are cautionary tales in what can go wrong with decisive mandates, right? But in the absence of, I think, the ability to negotiate, right, just some basic norms of how institutions functions across political parties, you're not going to get anywhere. Plutocracy cannot be taken on unless Parliament is functioning. Supreme Court cannot do it. RBI, cannot do it. That, that is what parliamentary committees are for. And the central link in the chain of representative democracy in India is so broken. Because that's where you can actually come to reasonable accommodations, right? I mean, that's what a deliberative democracy is about. Let's sit down, figure out something. Courts can't do it. I mean, it's, and we've seen the precipitous decline of those independent institutions. So I actually don't see that. I think Indian democracy is besotted with elections, rightly so. I think it performs its Schumpeterian function very well of a peaceful turnover of elites, right? But it's not performing its representative functions well, very close. Just one little point on that, the representative function. I mean, we were so obsessed with data around caste and religion. Globally in democracies, the big contest is trying to figure out, do young voters think differently or older voters, right? I think David Runciman at Cambridge has collected this data which looks at the median age of parliaments compared to the median age of the country. And of course, India is a young country. But globally, India is off the charts in how old our politicians are. Off the charts. Actually, Italy is the only country where I think the legislators are actually below the median age of the country. So when you have so many political channels blocked up, right, which are reasonable channels, I mean, you cannot get defense procurement going unless you have a good, credible parliamentary defense committee system. That's the bottom line. There's no other way of resolving these disputes, right? So I don't see in any political party yet a commitment to addressing those blockages.